Did you enjoy signing everything over to us that night, Mom? Daniel asked casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. And Margaret Collins felt the world tilt beneath her feet because she had no memory of signing anything at all. The hospital room had smelled faintly of antiseptic and something sharper. Something that clung to the back of the throat. And even now, days later, that scent seemed to follow her, lingering in her thoughts like a warning she hadn't understood in time. She had been discharged that morning after what the doctors called a mild episode brought on by exhaustion, though it had felt like more than that. Like her body had briefly betrayed her, leaving her disoriented and strangely hollow. Margaret sat at the small dining table in Daniel's house, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture as composed as it had always been, even when life had tested her in ways she never spoke about. Across from her, Daniel scrolled through his phone with the easy confidence of a man who believed everything was in order, while Olivia moved quietly between the kitchen and the table, placing dishes with careful precision, her smile practiced and warm, but her eyes never quite settling. It was a normal evening by all appearances, the kind Margaret had spent decades creating for her own family, yet something beneath the surface felt off, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise perfect melody. "I'm sorry," Margaret said finally, her voice steady but soft. "What exactly are you talking about?" Daniel looked up, a faint crease forming between his brows, not in concern, but in confusion that seemed almost rehearsed. "The documents, Mom," he replied. "Olivia said you went over everything at the hospital, that you agreed it would be easier this way." His tone was gentle, reassuring, but it carried an assumption that unsettled her more than any accusation could have. Margaret turned her gaze slowly toward Olivia, who paused for just a fraction of a second before setting down a glass of water in front of her, the movement smooth, controlled, almost too perfect. "You were very tired that night," Olivia said, her voice light, almost soothing. "We didn't want to overwhelm you, but you insisted on handling things then, said you didn't want to put it off." Margaret searched her memory, reaching for something solid, something she could hold on to, but all she found were fragments, flashes of dim lighting, the soft hum of machines, the weight of fatigue pressing her deeper into the hospital bed. She remembered Olivia sitting beside her, speaking in low tones, guiding her hand towards something, but the details slipped away each time she tried to grasp them, dissolving into a fog she couldn't push through. "I don't remember signing anything," Margaret said, not accusing, not yet, but the words landed heavily in the quiet space between them. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Olivia, one so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Margaret had spent a lifetime reading the small, unspoken signals that pass between people, and she felt something tighten in her chest. "Well," Daniel said after a moment, forcing a small laugh, "you were on medication, Mom. It's not surprising you don't remember every detail." He leaned back in his chair, as if the explanation settled everything, as if it closed the matter entirely. Margaret nodded slowly, though nothing about the situation felt settled, her mind circling back to the same unsettling realization that something had been decided, something important, and she had somehow been left out of the decision entirely. Olivia returned to the table, placing a plate in front of Margaret, her smile unchanged, her tone gentle. "You should eat while it's still warm," she said, and for a moment, Margaret simply looked at her, at the calmness in her expression, at the careful way she maintained control over every detail in the room, and a quiet thought formed, one she did not voice, not yet, but one that would not leave her. Whatever had happened that night in the hospital, it hadn't been as simple as they were making it seem, and somewhere in the spaces between what was said and what was left unsaid, Margaret knew there was a truth waiting to be uncovered. The house felt quieter than Margaret Collins remembered, not because it lacked sound, but because every sound seemed carefully controlled, measured, as if nothing was allowed to exist without permission. The next morning, Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window in thin, pale lines, landing across the polished countertop where Olivia had already arranged everything with deliberate precision. A cup of coffee placed exactly where Margaret usually sat. A plate of toast untouched. Waiting, Margaret paused at the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame, observing the scene before stepping in, the way one might observe a room that no longer fully belonged to them. "You should sit," Olivia said gently, not turning around immediately, as though she had sensed Margaret standing there without needing to look. "Doctor said you need to take it easy for a few days." Her tone carried concern, but it also carried something else, something firmer, something that felt less like care and more like instruction. Margaret nodded and moved toward the chair, lowering herself slowly, her body still adjusting, still not entirely her own after the hospital stay, and yet her mind felt sharper than it had in days, as if the fog that had surrounded her was beginning to thin, revealing shapes she had not noticed before. She reached for the coffee, but paused when she noticed her phone was not where she had left it the night before. "Have you seen my phone?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Olivia turned then, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I moved it to the living room so you would not be tempted to check emails first thing," she said lightly. "You need rest, Margaret, not stress." The explanation was simple, reasonable even, but something about the decision, the quiet way it had been made without her knowledge, settled uneasily in Margaret's chest. She took a sip of the coffee instead, letting the warmth spread slowly, grounding herself in something familiar, something still under her control. Daniel entered a moment later, adjusting the sleeve of his shirt, already halfway into his workday mindset. "Morning, Mom," he said, leaning down briefly to kiss her on the cheek, a gesture that felt automatic, practiced. Olivia said you slept well. Margaret looked at him, studying his face, searching for something that might confirm or deny the unease growing inside her. But all she saw was the same composed expression he had worn the night before. Assured, certain of something she did not yet understand. "I slept," she replied simply, then added after a pause. "I would like to see the documents you mentioned." The words were measured, careful, but they shifted something in the room almost immediately. Olivia's hand stilled for just a second as she reached for a napkin, and Daniel hesitated before responding, a fraction too long to be natural. "There is no rush," Olivia said smoothly, stepping in before Daniel could answer. "Everything is already taken care of. That was the whole point of doing it at the hospital, so you would not have to worry about it now." Margaret held her gaze, not challenging, not yet, but not retreating either. And in that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition perhaps, that the balance in the room was not as stable as it appeared. Margaret set her cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small, deliberate action that steadied her thoughts. She did not remember signing anything, but she remembered enough to know that the absence of memory was not an answer. It was a question, and questions, she had learned over a lifetime, had a way of leading to truths people would rather keep hidden. "Still," she said calmly, her voice carrying just enough weight to settle the matter for now, "I would like to see them." And though neither Daniel nor Olivia responded immediately, Margaret could feel it, the subtle shift beneath the surface, like the first crack forming in something that had been carefully constructed. And for the first time since leaving the hospital, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had not wanted to face. That whatever had happened that night was not a simple misunderstanding, but the beginning of something far more deliberate. Margaret Collins waited until the house settled into its afternoon quiet before she moved, not with urgency, but with intention. The kind that came from years of learning that answers rarely revealed themselves when chased too quickly. The living room was empty, sunlight stretching across the carpet in long, quiet lines, and her phone rested on the side table exactly where Olivia had said it would be, placed too neatly, too deliberately, as if even its position had been decided for her. Margaret picked it up slowly, feeling the familiar weight in her hand, a small comfort in a space that no longer felt entirely her own, and for a moment she simply stood there, listening, making sure she was alone. From the kitchen came the faint sound of running water, steady and controlled, and from upstairs, nothing at all. Daniel had already left for work, his absence as predictable as everything else in the house. Margaret unlocked the phone and began to scroll, not searching for anything specific at first, just letting her eyes move across messages, call logs, emails, until something caught her attention. A notification she did not remember seeing before, a confirmation email from a legal office she did not recognize. Her fingers hovered for a second before opening it, her pulse steady but deliberate, as if she already understood that whatever she was about to see would matter. The email was brief, formal, confirming receipt of signed documents and outlining next steps for the transfer of ownership. The language precise, impersonal, but unmistakable in its meaning. Margaret read it once, then again, slower the second time, letting each word settle into place. And as it did, a quiet realization began to form, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady and undeniable. She had not imagined it. Something had been signed, something important enough to trigger legal confirmation, and yet she had no clear memory of agreeing to any of it. She scrolled further, finding another message, this one from Daniel, sent late at night just days before, thanking someone for handling everything quickly, and mentioning that Mom signed without any issues. The words sat there on the screen, simple, direct, and completely foreign to her understanding of what had happened. Margaret lowered herself into the chair beside the table, the phone still in her hand, her posture composed even as her thoughts began to align into something sharper, something more focused. She did not panic. She did not rush to conclusions. Instead, she let the pieces settle. The email, the message, the memory of Olivia's voice in the hospital room, guiding, almost reassuring. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to revisit that night, not as a blur, but as a sequence. The dim light above her bed, the steady rhythm of machines, the heaviness in her limbs, and Olivia sitting close, speaking softly, placing a pen in her hand, telling her it was just a formality, something routine, something that needed to be done. Margaret's eyes opened slowly, the present returning with a clarity that felt almost cold, and for the first time since the conversation at the dinner table, the uncertainty began to take shape into something else, something more defined. This was not confusion, it was a gap, and gaps existed for a reason. She set the phone down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table just as she had done with her cup that morning. A small act of order in a situation that was beginning to reveal its disorder. From the kitchen, Olivia's voice carried lightly, asking if Margaret needed anything. The tone warm, attentive, unchanged, and Margaret responded just as evenly, "No, thank you." Her voice calm, almost gentle. But beneath that calm, something had shifted, something quiet and resolute. She would not confront them yet, not without understanding exactly what had been taken and how, because whatever had happened in that hospital room had not been an accident, and Margaret Collins had lived long enough to know that the truth, when approached with patience, had a way of revealing far more than anger ever could. Margaret Collins did not sleep much that night, not because she was restless, but because her mind had begun to move with a quiet, deliberate clarity that would not allow itself to be ignored. She lay still in the guest bedroom, the faint glow of the digital clock casting soft blue light across the ceiling, counting the minutes not in anxiety, but in thought, retracing each detail she could remember from the hospital, each word Olivia had spoken, each moment where her own awareness had seemed to slip just out of reach. By morning, she had already decided on her next step, not out of impulse, but out of necessity. When she entered the kitchen, Olivia was already there, as expected, moving through her routine with the same measured precision, the same calm efficiency that now felt less comforting than it once had. "Good morning," Olivia said with a gentle smile, placing a bowl of oatmeal on the table. "I made something light. The doctor said it would be easier on your system." Margaret returned the smile, equally gentle, equally composed, taking her seat without hesitation, as if nothing had changed. "Thank you," she said, her tone sincere, and for a moment, the scene might have appeared entirely ordinary, two women sharing a quiet morning, bound by family and routine, but beneath that surface, Margaret was watching, listening, noting the small details she had overlooked before. The way Olivia's eyes flickered toward her phone, the way her movements paused ever so slightly when Margaret spoke, the way control seemed to exist in every decision, no matter how small. Daniel joined them shortly after, his presence filling the room with a familiar energy, but even that felt different now, as though Margaret were seeing him not just as her son, but as a participant in something she had not yet fully uncovered. "I was thinking," Margaret began, stirring her oatmeal slowly, her voice steady, unhurried, "it might be a good idea for me to speak with Mr. Brooks again, just to make sure everything is in order with my paperwork." The effect was immediate, though subtle. Daniel's hand paused mid-motion as he reached for his coffee, and Olivia's smile tightened just slightly before settling back into place. "There is really no need for that," Olivia said smoothly, her tone still warm, still reassuring. "Everything has already been reviewed and finalized. You should focus on resting, not worrying about legal details." Margaret nodded as if considering the suggestion, taking a small bite before responding. "I understand, but it has always been my habit to review things personally. Gives me peace of mind." She looked up then, meeting Olivia's gaze directly, not challenging, but not yielding either. And for a brief moment, the air between them felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Daniel cleared his throat lightly, offering a small, dismissive chuckle. "Mom, Olivia handled all of that for you. She made sure everything was done properly. You can trust her." The words were meant to reassure, but they landed differently now, reinforcing something Margaret had already begun to suspect, that decisions had been made on her behalf, without her full awareness, without her true consent. Margaret set her spoon down carefully, aligning it beside the bowl with the same quiet precision she had shown before, a gesture that grounded her thoughts, that kept her centered. "I do trust her," she said calmly, her voice carrying no accusation, only quiet certainty. "And that is exactly why I would like to understand what was done." The silence that followed was brief, but meaningful, a pause that spoke more than any argument could have. Olivia's expression remained composed, but there was a new stillness in her posture, a subtle shift that Margaret did not miss. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, the sound distant, ordinary, but inside the house, something had changed, something that could not be undone. Margaret lifted her gaze once more, her eyes clear, steady, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, she was no longer searching for answers in confusion, but moving toward them with intention. Because whatever had been taken from her in that quiet hospital room was not just a matter of paperwork, It was a matter of trust. And trust, once questioned, had a way of revealing everything that had been hidden beneath it. Margaret Collins chose her moment carefully, not in haste, but with the quiet patience that had carried her through decades of raising a family, managing a home, and navigating situations far more complex than they had ever realized. That afternoon, while Olivia stepped out to run errands and the house settled into a rare stillness, Margaret picked up her phone again, this time not to search blindly, but with a clear intention guiding her actions. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she had been thinking about since the morning, Ethan Brooks, the attorney who had worked with her late husband for years, a man who had always valued precision and clarity over assumption. Margaret pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear, listening as it rang, her expression calm, her posture steady, as if she were simply making an ordinary call. When Ethan answered, his voice carried the same measured professionalism she remembered, though it softened slightly when he recognized her name. "Margaret, it has been a while," he said, and she allowed a small, polite smile to form, even though he could not see it. "It has," she replied, her tone composed. "I hope I am not interrupting, but I have a question about some documents that were recently signed on my behalf." There was a brief pause on the other end, not of hesitation, but of attention, as though he were already shifting into the careful mindset that had made him reliable for so many years. "Of course," he said. "What kind of documents are we talking about?" Margaret glanced toward the hallway, ensuring the house remained quiet, before continuing. "That is exactly what I would like to confirm. I received a notification regarding a transfer, but I do not recall reviewing or approving it in full." She chose her words deliberately, not accusing, not speculating, simply presenting the facts as she understood them. Ethan's tone changed slightly, becoming more focused, more precise. "Do you have a copy of the documents or the name of the firm that processed them?" Margaret opened the email again, reading off the details, and as she spoke, she could almost hear him taking mental notes, piecing together information with the same methodical approach she remembered from years before. When she finished, there was another pause, longer this time, but not empty, carried weight, the kind that suggested something had already begun to form in his mind. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice steady but more serious than before. "Those kinds of transfers usually require clear verification, especially if they involve significant assets. Were you fully aware of what you were signing at the time?" Margaret did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she understood the importance of the question, the way it framed everything that might follow. "I was in the hospital," she said at last, her voice even, "and I was not in a condition to review anything thoroughly." The silence that followed was brief, but it carried a shift, subtle yet unmistakable. "I see," Ethan replied, his tone now carefully measured. "In that case, I would strongly recommend we take a closer look at those documents together. There may be details that need clarification." Margaret nodded, even though he could not see her, the motion reinforcing the quiet resolve that had been building within her since the night of her discharge. "I would appreciate that," she said. "I will arrange a time to meet with you as soon as possible." When the call ended, Margaret lowered the phone slowly, placing it on the table with the same deliberate care she had shown before, and for a moment, she allowed herself to sit in the silence, not as a passive observer, but as someone who had just taken the first real step toward understanding what had been done. The house remained quiet, unchanged on the surface, but beneath that calm, something had shifted once again. No longer just suspicion or unease, but the beginning of a process, one that would not rely on assumptions or explanations given too easily, but on facts, on clarity, and on the careful unraveling of something that had been constructed without her full knowledge. And as Margaret Collins sat there, her expression composed, her thoughts aligned with a new sense of purpose, she understood that whatever had been taken from her would not remain hidden for long, not now that she had begun to look for it in the right way. Margaret Collins did not announce her plans, nor did she allow any visible change in her routine to suggest that anything had shifted, because she understood now that silence was not weakness, it was strategy. The following morning unfolded with the same quiet precision as the days before. Olivia moving through the kitchen with effortless control, Daniel preparing for work, and Margaret taking her place at the table as if she were still simply recovering, still unaware, still trusting. "You seem better today," Olivia remarked, placing a glass of water in front of her, her tone warm, observant, and Margaret offered a small nod in return. "I am feeling stronger," she said, her voice calm, measured, giving nothing away. Daniel glanced at her briefly, then back to his watch, already thinking about his schedule. "That is good, Mom. Just take it slow. No need to rush into anything." The words were familiar, reassuring on the surface, but Margaret heard them differently now, not as concern, but as a subtle attempt to keep her within a boundary she had not agreed to. She picked up her spoon, taking a small bite, her movements steady, unhurried, and for a moment, the conversation drifted into ordinary topics, the weather, errands, small details that filled space without meaning. But Margaret listened differently now, not just to what was said, but to what was avoided, to the absence of any mention of the documents, the transfer, the decisions that had already been made. Later that afternoon, Olivia suggested they go through some paperwork together, presenting it as a helpful gesture, a way to keep everything organized, and Margaret agreed without hesitation, her expression open, cooperative, exactly as Olivia expected. They sat at the dining table, papers spread neatly between them, and Olivia guided the conversation with careful ease, pointing out minor details, routine updates, things that appeared harmless, insignificant. Margaret followed along, nodding occasionally, asking simple questions, allowing Olivia to maintain control of the flow. But beneath that calm participation, she was observing, noting which documents were presented and which were not, which explanations came too quickly, which details were glossed over. "Everything important has already been taken care of," Olivia said at one point, her tone light, almost dismissive, as if to reassure Margaret that there was nothing left to worry about. And Margaret responded with a soft smile. "I appreciate how much you have handled," the words sincere in tone, but carrying a quiet weight beneath them, one Olivia did not seem to notice. As the afternoon light shifted across the table, Margaret's attention sharpened on a single detail, a reference to a transfer that was mentioned briefly, almost casually, before being redirected to something else. She did not interrupt, did not question it directly, but she marked it, storing it alongside everything else she had begun to gather. When they finished, Olivia collected the papers with the same controlled efficiency, stacking them neatly, maintaining the appearance of order, and Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her posture composed, her expression unchanged. "Thank you for going through that with me," she said gently, and Olivia smiled in return, satisfied, confident, unaware that the balance she believed she maintained had already begun to shift. That evening, as Margaret sat alone in the quiet of the living room, her phone resting beside her, she replayed the conversation in her mind, not as a series of words, but as a pattern, one that revealed itself more clearly with each pass. She had seen enough now to understand that the truth would not be handed to her openly. It would have to be uncovered piece by piece, through patience, through observation, through allowing others to believe she had not yet seen what was right in front of her. And as she sat there, her gaze steady, her thoughts aligned with a quiet resolve, Margaret Collins made a decision. She did not speak aloud. She would let them continue exactly as they were, because the more comfortable they felt, the more certain they became that she did not understand, the easier it would be for her to see everything they had tried to keep hidden. Margaret Collins arrived at Ethan Brooks's office 2 days later, precisely on time, her posture upright, her expression calm, as if she were attending a routine appointment rather than stepping into something that would confirm what she had already begun to suspect. The building itself was familiar, its quiet professionalism unchanged, the same polished floors and muted tones that reflected a world where details mattered and assumptions were never accepted without verification. Ethan greeted her with a firm but respectful nod, guiding her into his office where a folder already rested on the desk, neatly arranged, waiting. Margaret took her seat without hesitation, placing her handbag beside her chair, her movements measured, controlled, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, allowing the space to settle into the kind of silence that often preceded important conversations. "I reviewed the information you sent," Ethan began, his tone direct, focused, "and I was able to obtain copies of the documents in question." He opened the folder and slid a set of papers toward her, not rushing, not dramatizing, simply presenting the facts as they were. Margaret looked down at the pages, her eyes moving carefully across the lines, recognizing her name, her signature, the official formatting that made everything appear legitimate at first glance. But as she continued reading, the details became clearer, the language more precise, and with it, the implications more significant: ownership transfers, authorization clauses, control over accounts that had always been under her direct management, all outlined in terms that left little room for interpretation. Margaret did not react outwardly, her expression remaining composed, but inside, the pieces aligned fully for the first time, forming a complete picture of what had been done. "These were signed during your hospital stay," Ethan continued, watching her carefully, not for emotion, but for understanding, "and they indicate full consent and awareness." Margaret lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes steadily. "I was not in a condition to give either," she said, her voice calm, without accusation, simply stating the truth as she knew it. Ethan nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. "That is consistent with the timing," he replied, "which raises concerns about the validity of the signatures, especially given the scope of what was transferred." He paused briefly, then added, "There are also irregularities in how these documents were processed. The timeline is unusually compressed, and certain verification steps appear to have been bypassed." Margaret absorbed this information without interruption, her thoughts moving not in shock, but in confirmation, each detail reinforcing what she had already begun to understand. She placed her hand lightly on the edge of the document, grounding herself in the physical reality of it, the weight of the paper, the permanence it represented. "What can be done?" she asked, her tone steady, focused not on what had happened, but on what would come next. Ethan leaned back slightly, considering. "There are several options, but the most effective approach will depend on how you want to proceed. We can challenge the validity directly, which would require evidence of your condition at the time, or we can take a more strategic route, allowing those involved to reveal more before taking formal action." Margaret listened carefully, recognizing the significance of the choice being presented, not just legally, but personally. She thought of the house, of the quiet routines, of Olivia's careful control, of Daniel's unquestioning acceptance, and she understood that the situation extended beyond documents and signatures. It was about trust, about intention, about the way something had been taken without her full awareness. She looked back at Ethan, her expression unchanged, but her resolve clear. "I would prefer to understand everything before making it known that I am aware." she said, her voice calm, deliberate, and Ethan gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging not just her decision, but the strength behind it. Then we proceed carefully, he replied, closing the folder with quiet precision, and we make sure that when the truth comes out, it is complete. Margaret rose from her chair, gathering her things with the same composed movements she had maintained throughout, and as she stepped out of the office, the air outside felt different, not lighter, not easier, but clearer, because now there was no uncertainty left, only a path forward, one that she would follow not with anger, but with the same quiet determination that had carried her this far, knowing that those who believed she had not understood were about to learn exactly how much she had seen. Margaret Collins returned to the house that evening with the same calm composure she had maintained all week, her expression unchanged, her movements unhurried, as though nothing of significance had shifted, and that was precisely what allowed everything else to unfold as it did. Olivia greeted her at the door with a warm smile, asking casually about her afternoon, and Margaret responded just as easily, offering simple answers that revealed nothing, her tone light, her presence steady, giving no indication that she now understood far more than either of them realized. Dinner that night was arranged with more care than usual, the table set neatly, candles lit though it was not a special occasion, and Margaret noticed it immediately, the subtle effort to create an atmosphere, to guide the tone of the evening before a single word had been spoken. Daniel arrived shortly after, his mood relaxed, his attention divided between his phone and the conversation, and as they sat down together, the routine unfolded in familiar patterns, small talk, polite exchanges, the kind of normalcy that had once felt genuine but now carried an undercurrent Margaret could not ignore. "I was thinking," Olivia said partway through the meal, her voice smooth, almost casual, "it might be a good idea to start planning the next steps for the property, just to make sure everything transitions smoothly." Margaret looked up slowly, meeting her gaze with quiet attentiveness. "What kind of steps do you have in mind?" she asked, her tone neutral, inviting explanation rather than confrontation. Olivia smiled slightly, as if encouraged. "Nothing complicated, just making sure everything is aligned with what was already signed. It will make things easier for all of us moving forward." Daniel nodded in agreement, adding lightly, "It is just about keeping things organized. Mom, you do not need to worry about the details anymore." Margaret let a small pause settle before responding, allowing the weight of their words to exist fully in the space between them, and then she placed her fork down carefully, aligning it beside her plate with deliberate precision. "I agree that things should be clear," she said calmly, her voice steady, "which is why I took the time to review everything properly today." The shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Olivia's posture stiffened just slightly. Daniel's expression faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced a small smile. "That is great, Mom," he said quickly. "Then you know it is all taken care of." Margaret held his gaze, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty that carried far more weight than any raised voice could have. "I know exactly what was taken care of," she replied, her words measured, precise, and for the first time, the calm she had maintained began to feel less like recovery and more like control. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her tone still gentle, but now edged with something sharper. "Margaret, there is no need to make this complicated. Everything was done with your best interest in mind." Margaret turned her attention to her, her expression composed, her eyes clear. "My best interest requires my full understanding," she said, not raising her voice, not breaking her calm, but leaving no room for interpretation. The room grew quieter then, the careful balance that had been maintained over the past days beginning to shift in a way that could no longer be smoothed over with reassurances or casual explanations. Margaret reached for her glass, taking a small sip before setting it back down with the same deliberate care she had shown all evening, and as she did, she understood that the moment she had been preparing for was no longer approaching. It had arrived. She did not reveal everything she knew. Not yet. but she allowed just enough of it to surface. Enough to disrupt the certainty Olivia had relied on. Enough to make Daniel question what he had accepted without hesitation. And as the silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken realization, Margaret Collins remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, composed, and entirely in control of what would happen next. The silence at the table did not break immediately, settled instead, heavy and deliberate, as if each person present understood that whatever had been carefully maintained was no longer intact. Margaret Collins did not rush to fill it. She allowed it to exist, to stretch just long enough for its meaning to take hold. Her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but her presence now carrying a quiet authority that neither Daniel nor Olivia could ignore. Daniel was the first to shift, his fingers tightening slightly around his glass before he set it down, his voice attempting to recover its earlier ease. "Mom, if there is something confusing, we can go over it again. There is no need to make assumptions." Margaret turned her gaze toward him slowly, her eyes steady, not harsh, but clear in a way that left little room for deflection. "There is no confusion," she said, her tone even. "Only information that was not fully shared with me." Olivia straightened in her seat, her composure still intact, though the effort to maintain it had become more visible now. "Everything was done legally, Margaret, with your signature and your approval." Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "A signature does not always mean understanding," she replied, her voice quiet but firm, and the distinction settled into the space between them with undeniable weight. She reached into her bag then, not abruptly, but with the same measured control she had shown throughout, and placed a single document on the table, sliding it forward just enough for both of them to see. "I took the time to review everything with Mr. Brooks today," she continued, her tone unchanged, "including the timeline and the conditions under which these documents were signed." Daniel's expression shifted more noticeably now, the certainty he had relied on beginning to falter. "Mom, we were only trying to help. You were not in a position to handle things at the time." Margaret met his words with a calm that did not waver. "Help requires clarity, Daniel, not decisions made in someone else's absence." Olivia's voice followed quickly, more controlled than before, but carrying a sharper edge. "We did what was necessary to keep everything stable." Margaret looked at her then, fully, her gaze steady, unwavering, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow to that single exchange. "Stable for whom?" she asked softly, not raising her voice, but allowing the question to land exactly where it needed to. Neither of them answered immediately, and in that silence, the truth they had avoided began to take its place, no longer hidden behind explanations or intentions. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her composure untouched, and when she spoke again, her words were not louder, not harsher, but final in a way that required no repetition. "I have already begun the process of correcting what was done," she said, "and I will continue to do so with full clarity and proper review." Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture no longer concealed, while Olivia remained still, her expression controlled, but her confidence no longer as certain as it had been. Margaret rose from her chair then, not in anger, not in haste, but with the same quiet dignity she had carried through every moment of the past days. And as she stepped away from the table, she paused just long enough to leave them with the one truth they could no longer avoid. "You believed I would not understand," she said, her voice calm, steady. "That was the only mistake that mattered." And with that, she turned and walked toward the hallway, leaving behind not chaos, not confrontation, but something far more lasting. The complete unraveling of a certainty they had relied on, replaced now by the quiet, undeniable reality that Margaret Collins had seen everything, and she would not allow it to remain as it was.